We have 12 minutes, 13 minutes, because we really don't want to overrun these guys anymore. And as by means of a brief introduction, before I introduce the panel members, the theme of the conference was very well chosen. We really thought about this, the pain of blockchain and the pain of growing up. So very quickly, we're going to do the panel in sort of 3 short sections, and we're going to look at it as if it was a teenager. And we all know the pain of growing up, and I looked a lot into sort of the whole brain thing with teenagers, particularly men, because it lasts till they're 25. So I did a lot of study to sort of try to understand my son. And the beauty of youth is that you can do anything. You dare to do anything. The world is your oyster. And the other thing is, you have no idea of the impact of your actions. And that sort of slot, that's what I always said to him, this is the slot that I have to protect you. All the rest is cool. And then, of course, you get to 18, 19, and it's like, people start nagging you and they say, well, you've got to start making choices at some point. You cannot do everything. Life is also about choices. And they all say, I want to be successful. I said, well, the key thing to success is really every now and then do what you enjoy most, but also choose. So that's the next part. It's going to be about choice. And then the final part, we're going to talk about execution, because it's all well and good, but if you don't execute, it's going to be a miserable failure. And failure, by the way, as I said, is allowed as long as we carry on. So very quickly, Arno, Laeven, to our very left. I'm not going to do huge bios. They're all on the website, but you have a vast array of experience as a blockchain consultant. You worked, if I'm correct, with projects at KLM, Shell, I mean, a range of companies. So we're going to use you from that perspective, the multi-project perspective. Obviously, Mark Buitenhek, well known, delighted that he's on the panel, because I secretly always say to people, when they say, oh, you know, innovation in payments and in finance in Holland, and they say Mark Buitenhek, and I proudly say he gets it. So he's on the panel. And then, of course, Dave Birch. He's the enfant terrible, and that's his natural role, comes natural to him. So you're going to be the teenager in this panel.
I'll be the teenager, okay.
You'll be the teenager. So let's go to the pain bit. And I start with you, Arno. If you look across various projects, and we look at the stage blockchain is now, what would you say are really like the pain points of where we are as an industry? Is it the disappointment, the lack of success? Where are the pain points?
All of the above, I would say. I think we simply do not understand what blockchain is yet, in the sense that we understand very well what Bitcoin is, and it works, but that's the only application of blockchain that is really, really working, and already for a couple of years. So we still see a lot of POCs up here, and it's funny because the whole washing machine thing, one of the first papers I read about blockchain was actually by IBM, Paul Brody, writing about a Samsung IBM thing they did together, which is 3 years ago, and it was a washing machine ordering its own detergent or something like that. So we haven't come any further than washing machines, I would say, and that's pretty disappointing.
Yeah, well, we have more
from one
cases.
point.
Yeah,
but
yeah. And if you sort of look at this from a banking perspective, because you went through many cases, you selected a few, so we'll come to that later. But what have been the most dramatic lessons learned for you, or what has been your personal pain in the blockchain?
I must admit, well, you talked about the 3 stages. I don't even think we're in the 3rd stage yet. We're still in the play stage. And I think what happened to us is that this came from the technology end, right? The business didn't have a clue, yeah. I didn't have a clue at all. And then suddenly there was a question, and then we asked something, and Dennis, now here, the lead at KPMG, was at that stage my business manager. Yeah. And we started the whole process just by asking not through the regular processes in committees and those kind of things, but just post something on an internal WhatsApp and just ask people. Within a few hours, we got hundreds of reactions of all our IT people who were already years working on this stuff. Yeah. This, for me, talking about the valuable lessons, we used to be a bank and we did IT to support the banking activities. Now it's the other way around. We are a tech company with a banking license, and we're just in the middle of the process to understand actually what it is and what it means. Yeah. And blockchain, the enormous enthusiasm of people doing new stuff, and I still remember meetings with 100 people brainstorming, and we didn't have a clue. And for me, it looked quite familiar to something I went through in the 90s myself. when we did chip, knip, chipper, those kind of chip cards, everything was possible on the chip card.
Yeah.
And it felt a bit like the similar things. A technology searching for a problem or a solution or an answer, etc. And that, taking those lessons with me, I think we're still in that stage, really trying to understand what it is. There are still people, after 10 times explaining what blockchain is, and said, yeah, that's Bitcoin, right? But understanding the magnitude of what is possible in combination with Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blah, 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 that is too big for a lot of people to grasp.
So
and talking about pains, keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah,
really.
keep it as simple
we started
as possible.
making 30-second movies just to explain. We're now running a blockchain university that travels across all our business units in geographies where it attracts many people who are still extremely enthusiastic. But we have to start with the basics.
Yeah, and there's one more follow-up question from me, and it's probably slightly facetious, but banks have normally very structured processes to get to a point, and they love spreadsheets and that sort of management. Do you feel that that sort of way of approaching thing was a hindrance in blockchain, or did you throw it overboard to begin with?
No, we let it go.
Yeah.
We let this go. And that is one thing, there's also one big lesson for that. If you got high enough support in the organization, you can do whatever you want, right?
Okay.
You can free up capacity. You don't have to go through all the steps that we do later.
Yeah.
And I guess that is what we did in the beginning. We didn't have a clue. Let's be clear. I could give brilliant speeches about it, but we didn't really know what we were doing. We were just testing as wide as we could, as with different things as we could.
Yeah.
And then slowly we started saying, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. Should we go through one consortium or two? Should we do single things, etc.?
Yeah.
And slowly we started moving into a more structured way of operating, applying what we call our PACE methodology, which is a method to innovate, which we copied from GE and made it our own, etc. And that really accelerates the whole thing. And that's what you just saw, the presentation from our Easy Trade Connect. We use that same methodology, but it's still the people who come up with the ideas. Yeah. And the closer they are to the IT and the IT of the business and the business, the better it works.
The better it works. And David, if we look at the positive sides of being a teenager, like anything's possible, let's explore the world. What do you think we haven't explored yet in the blockchain?
Well, I think that and you might criticize this as being a too technological perspective, but I don't think we've really used the technology yet, in the sense that the applications that we've been, I mean, I'll put one or two others aside for a moment, but generally speaking, what we've been talking about is how do we use blockchain essentially to do things we already do. I mean, I don't doubt for one moment that the blockchain can make the sending invoices to China a bit quicker or something. I'm sure that's true, but that's not going to revolutionize anything.
No, why send invoices? Huh? That's a revolution.
Yeah. Well, you're just putting the hash of the invoice on the blockchain, right? So. But you know what I mean? Like, that's an existing process, and I can't help feeling that that's not the lesson of technologies. You know, when people keep going on about how the blockchain's like the internet was, well, you know, it wasn't the existing things that, like Facebook. There wasn't like a hopeless Facebook that was really inefficient, and then we came along and made an efficient one by using the internet. Like, that's not quite how these things work. So my suspicion is that actually, it's new kinds of transactions, new kinds of markets, which are where the blockchain will really come alive. And there are certain characteristics of the blockchain, I know we've discussed this before, but there are certain characteristics of the blockchain around things like transparency, for example, which are a window into a different way of organizing markets, and in particular, a different way of regulating markets. Yeah. And so my feeling is, yes, we're in those kind of teenage years, and it's a lot of advantages will come from using the technology in these things, but they're not the breakthrough cases. The breakthrough cases will be doing things in a different way.
Yeah. But I often refer to blockchain. People ask, like, it's like we had no idea what we could do with the internet before we had the browser, and we're probably still even in those sort of early stages. And Arno, moving on to the next part, if it's about making choices, you do a lot of, as a consultant, you do a lot of projects, so you see it in many places. Is there a best practice, or is there something you see that really is helpful in finding focus and deciding what you want to do with the blockchain?
Yeah, I think, and this chimes in with what Mark was saying about. You know, he said at ING they were looking very broadly first at projects and then trying to find their way. I think I've come to the conclusion that first you have to be able to envision let's say, what the possibility is of blockchain on the longer term. And then you start working backwards and saying, okay, well, if this is what I believe that blockchain can do, then where should we start?
Yeah.
Instead of the other way around, because we're now trying to look at blockchain with our current lens on, right? So with our current problems. And that's how we end up with all kinds of projects in supply chain, etc., which are, I admit, which are real problems.
Optimizers.
But my question always to the business is, when we do a blockchain project, why hasn't this problem been solved before?
Yeah.
And then if the answer is because we are a lot of parties and we don't trust each other, et cetera, then I think we have a good starting point to talk about blockchain. But if that's not the case, then why should we look at blockchain?
Can you give me an example of such a case that really addresses something new?
Sorry?
Can you give me an example of a case that really addresses something so new?
Well, I think so. So ultimately, what blockchain can enable, in my view, is autonomous anything, I would almost say, but autonomous processes. Let's start with that. So I very much believe that we are going towards a world in which we will be governed by algorithms, in the sense that algorithms will make decisions for us. Then I want to make very sure that that algorithm takes the right data. And is talking to the right people, and that my privacy is secured. And I think that blockchain plays very much a role in there. And then if we roll that back, so where to start, then we say, well, let's first start maybe with the security part or with the privacy part. Yeah. Because that's so important before we go into a direction in which indeed you know everything about someone else's pants just because they are have a tag on it.
Well, to comment on what you're saying, I just described, to be clear, how we started. So nobody had an idea. There were lots of people going through. There was an extreme enthusiasm. And then indeed we ran into the issue, aren't we just reproducing or recreating what we already have created? Are we just looking for cost issues, right? And then the imaginary thing started, and indeed I fully agree with your conclusion, and that's why we joined a consortium around identity, because the identity thing in let's say the digitized world is one of the key elements that, and we see that on a day-by-day basis, KYC, etc. We have currently a program running in the Netherlands, where, although the Netherlands across the world, where again we're basically doing all the KYC that we ever did again. We didn't have time to reinvent that whole process, so we're going through the same thing, a bit more optimized, etc. Parallel, we now started a KYC track where we start all over again, right? How would you do this? How would you do KYC? And not optimizing what we're having today, but how would you do that? When you talk about trade and you talk about containers and ships, etc., if you're able to track everything that is going on around the world, you talked about invoices and sending invoices. If you can simply track the things that are in a container, and that sooner they come out of that container, they're offloaded and they're shipped somewhere, the invoice actually is being paid, because that is the whole invoice, then you start thinking about a completely new way of working. But first we had to learn, very painfully, the basics.
Well, I'm actually quite, I mean, despite what I said earlier on, I'm actually quite optimistic about that, because I think identity is one of the areas where we do have this, we have a crushing set of problems which are stopping progress in a lot of areas. And here's a radical new technology, which, if we allow ourselves to think about things in very different ways, actually could offer some new solutions in that. And in fact, the heater example just now, I think is a, because it's funny, I didn't finish my slides this morning, but the last slide I had this morning was about using Quorum for Internet of Things. And the particular reason I'd chosen Quorum for that was because Quorum have incorporated Zcash into their infrastructure, so that you can use zero-knowledge proofs, which means keeping any kind of personally identifiable information off of the chain. And now something like that is a really new way of dealing with a problem like identity. And I think your gut feeling about this is almost certainly correct. So the priority of the identity problems should be much higher. But actually, we now have some new tools for potentially doing it in a new way. So I think we can be optimistic about that.
I feel
that.
And that's why, because you can, we almost thought it was like the chip card kind of thing. I saw it coming when we were talking about the next phase. So the first 3 years you can easily manage, right? If you're high enough in the organization, it's done. But after 3 years, people start talking about what is the business case, what are we actually getting out of this, why are we doing this, 3 million here, 5 million there, blah, blah, blah. But there was no discussion at all that we should take a bit more time and endurance, because we truly think that 3 years is simply not enough to dive into this. Let's hold on another 3 or another 4 years and then decide what to do.
Well, exactly, and particularly in your industry, it falls beautifully together with all the other industry initiatives that we are facing at the moment. So coming to the last... The last execution thing, and it's to your point, and I always wonder, how do you define success of a blockchain project? Because you know that you're begging for money, you've got to have C-level approval, you know the risks are high, we all know all that. But how would you suggest people define success for a project? Like, do we continue, do we stop it? How would you, I'm looking at all of you as well, like, can we monetize it, or it creates greater loyalty, or it gives us new insights? I mean, how do you create the definition of success?
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking to. So if I'm talking to the CFO, then it's about NPV. And if I'm talking to the strategist, then it's about how is blockchain going to help us deliver on our strategy. To give an example of that, when I was at Philips, the strategy of Philips is to move from a product-oriented company to a service-oriented company, with data being very important. But medical data and privacy, you can imagine that there's an issue. And it was really, really nice to see the demonstration here of the two healthcare apps. Because I believe there's a point there where if you want to do that, so if data is going to be the center of your strategy, then you better make sure that you validate the integrity of the data. And that is where blockchain comes in and can have a big role.
Can I make one little point about the smart card point? I think that is a much more interesting analogy, and I think there's a much more interesting lesson to be learned. I think you're right. So if you go back to those days of chip, nip, chipper, Mondex, SEMS, like all of those things failed essentially. The payment bit, but they drove the development of the underlying ecosystem, and in particular, the development of multi-application smart cards was very rapid because of their demands. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so now, all my EMV cards, my SIM card, everything runs using those new that were developed under those pressures. And I think that is a kind of analogy with the blockchain. I'm not a big fan of the payments. I'm not convinced at all that we're going to be paying for taxes with Bitcoin. But driving the development of the underlying infrastructure could lead to new ways of implementing. So I think it's actually quite an interesting analogy.
Talking about being data-driven, because we are data-driven, and well, at least we are trying to become data-driven. I think we're doing a pretty good job, but we're not good enough. And this is part of that whole journey. So for us, it's more the strategic perspective that counts right now. Are we really building up a company that is able to survive in that digital age, where customer is centric, where the data is centric? Because without data, you're not able to work on that.
You can't offer relevance.
So for me, there is no, and of course, we like to have, we define success right now in having live pilots and going to the markets, etc. Yeah. But not in terms yet of NPVs, and you need to make that millions. It's simply too early stage.
It's too early
If you do that, you kill it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Because in the interest of time, I could talk to them. I had like another 20 questions, and I'm sure that some of them would be very useful to all of us. I'm going to call it quits, because we want to have a tea break, and we want to see you back in half an hour for a last very riveting session. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a few more interviews with the three of you, and then put them online. Thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you to the production as well. Thank you to you.